Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg.
Very good, very good.
Wonderful to see so many of you here today as the school year gets off to a good start. I'm Dean Schall, Dean of NYU's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, and thrilled not only to welcome all of you, but of course to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister of the UK, Nick Clegg, and he's here with two of his colleagues, Her Majesty's Ambassador, Sir Nigel Sheinwald, and Sir Alan Collins, the British Consul General. And as all of us New Yorkers know, it's impossible to get around this week with the UN General Assembly, and this is why we're lucky to have such leaders in our presence this week. I've spent the last few days at what NYU calls its Common Days, which are the university's leadership 3 times a year gathers to discuss the future of the university, and we've spent most of our time in these last few days discussing the Global Network University and all its implications. And it occurred to me as I was going to get to introduce the Deputy Prime Minister that our hopes for the Global Network University are very much represented in what he brings to us today. So our hopes are that our students will study on more than one continent and learn the world, not just their own region or their own country. Our hopes are that they will get to study with people who bring multiple perspectives to all the questions that they're asking. And ultimately, our hope is that higher education is a force for peace in the world. Now, it turns out that the Deputy Prime Minister is not only a compelling political leader, engaged in an incredibly fascinating experiment in co-leadership, but also exemplifies the quality of cosmopolitanism that we aspire to for so many of you. He speaks 5 languages. He went to college and graduate school on 2 continents in 3 countries. He worked in New York, London, Budapest, and Brussels on issues affecting the EU, Central Asia, China, and Russia. We don't expect each of you to be elected Deputy Prime Minister, but it is an extraordinary background and perspective he brings to such a critical role at this juncture in our history. And it turns out that the mechanism he uses to engage his own constituents is a town hall. So when he asked if he might come and speak with you, his preference was really to engage. We insisted that he begin with some remarks because we were eager to hear him, but his remarks will be brief, and then there will be plenty of opportunity for Q&A. So it is with great honor and great pleasure that I bring to you the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg.
That's very kind. Thank you very, very much for that. Whoa, that's very heavy. Can you? Yeah. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. You make me sound like a sort of walking version of the United Nations, and you very generously described my time in America, New York, as work. In fact, I was a fact checker for Christopher Hitchens at The Nation magazine. I've no idea whether the magazine carries on in my slightly more radical days. To describe it as work, I think is probably pushing it a bit. But that was about 20 years ago when I was spent 6 months in New York, which had been preceded by a year's study as a student in the University of Minnesota after I'd graduated from Cambridge University in the UK. And little did I think that when I was fact-checking, I don't know, his articles on Marxist guerrilla movements in Latin America, that 20 years later I'd be back in this great city representing a new coalition government at the United Nations at the Millennium Development Goals Summit. So it's a huge, huge privilege, a great sort of sense of excitement that I'm standing before you here. And as was said, I will just literally just sort of try and set the context a bit, perhaps explain, if I may, not who I am, but but what this new government is in the United Kingdom, because it was described as an experiment. It's certainly new. British politics for decades now had settled into a comfortable, someone would say, rather predictable rhythm of, one government's a Conservative government, and then it's the Labour government, and then it's the right, and then it's the left, and then it's the Socialists, and then it's the Conservatives, and then it's the red corner, and then it's the blue corner. And this went on like this for a long time. And it suited a world in which we had the great sort of polarizing ideological divisions in the world between communism and capitalism, where class-based politics in Britain meant that people either voted for the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, yes, perhaps out of ideological conviction, but also because it was a part of their social identity. So if you came from certain parts of the country, you did certain trades or vocations, it kind of just was baked in the cake that you would either vote for one of the two old class-based parties. And then you had the Liberal Party, which was the predecessor to my party, the Liberal Democrats, who were formed in the 80s, which in turn sort of were drawing on a long heritage of liberal party politics, which stretches right into the 19th century. In fact, the Liberal Party, the party of Gladstone, was a dominant political force in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, but had been squeezed out by this reassertion of two-party, sort of polarized, binary politics in much of the 20th century. I know, by the way, liberal is a dirty word in parts of the political discourse of this country. It's got a slightly more inoffensive connotation in the United Kingdom context, and one that I'm very, very proud of. But anyway, things started sort of changing bit by bit. I mean, back in the 1950s, in the 1951 general election, just to illustrate to you how complete this sort of Cold War binary politics was in Britain, in the 1951 general election, only 2% of people didn't vote for either the Labour or the Conservative parties. So it was complete. The world was divided into north versus south, right versus left, communism versus capitalism. And we had an electoral system, which I won't bore you about. I can bore you about, but I won't bore you about, which kind of buttressed and actually exacerbated this kind of two-party dominance. But then things started changing. We had the sort of social changes, as there was greater sort of emancipation, the spread of education, greater social mobility, the great sort of establishment of the welfare state after the war created a degree of social fluidity, which Britain had not experienced in a long time. Then, of course, you had the collapse of the Cold War, which removed a lot of the ideological underpinnings behind this kind of pattern. And bit by bit by bit, people started voting differently. They didn't just vote for the two old teams. They didn't just vote for the red team or the blue team. So much so that this last general election, I think I need to check my facts, but I think close to 40% of people voted for other parties. Notably, my party, the Liberal Democrats, who at the last election, the one held in May, we got 7 million votes, 24%, I think just shy of 24% of the vote, but because of the slightly arcane system we've got, about 8% of the seats in the Commons. But look, the picture was basically one of these kind of great icebergs of the old political order, kind of just disintegrating over time. And that was accompanied, by the way, by something which I think is a deeply worrying trend, which is actually a trend you see across much of the democratic world, which is just an increasing level of non-engagement from politics altogether, just people not voting at all. In fact, in the 2001 and 2005 general elections, for the first time in British political history, more people didn't vote than voted for the winning party. So you've got a picture of old tribalisms collapsing, old ideologies dissolving, social patterns changing, greater mobility and fluidity, and an increasing trend towards mass abstention and disengagement from politics. So I think, with the benefit of hindsight, at one point the dam was going to break. At one point the kind of old patterns of the past had to kind of evolve into something new. And that's in effect what happened at this last general election. Because we suddenly had this result. We had an exciting general election, which was Americanized in some sense by the advent of television leadership debates. And we got a result where nobody won. Nobody won. The British people basically said, we don't think any of you lot deserve the keys of number 10 Downing Street on your own. So we had a choice as a political class. We could have either pitched the country back into a grinding, sort of debilitating period of yet more pre-election politics and have another general election in the autumn, say, which in my judgment, and I think in the judgment of most people, would have been crippling for the nation. We're facing some really, really difficult issues. We're at war in Afghanistan. We've got big social problems. We've got problems in our public services, and we're facing the biggest deficit of any time in our country's history, in peacetime history. So my view was very, very firmly that far from doing the easy thing, which was to retreat into sort of partisan tribalism again and say, well, let's have another go and bash each other to bits and then see whether people come up with a clearer answer. Let's do something unusual, and let's try and put our differences aside and govern in the national interest. And that is what David Cameron, the leader of the Conservative Party and now Prime Minister, and myself, the leader of the Liberal Democrats and now Deputy Prime Minister, have done. And we created, forged in record time, 5 days, an agreement between our parties, two parties that have been foes and still are on the ground. We still compete against each other. We have separate identities, separate histories, separate different futures. But on this occasion, we decided it was best for the national interest that we try and govern well, not least to deal with these huge challenges we face, dealing with this massive legacy of debts that we've got hanging around our neck. And we've done something which I think has surprised people. Firstly, we've got on. Doesn't mean we agree. In fact, I found it surprisingly easy to get on with someone who you know you don't agree with, because you don't get surprised when you find you disagree. And secondly, I think we've been much, much more radical than people expected. The familiar refrain in the British political discourse has always been, oh, coalition politics would be a disaster. Yes, okay, some of these continental folk in Europe might do it, but we don't do it because you can't possibly govern. You can't do radical things. You can't move fast enough. You can't take decisive action. Now, 5 months later, everyone's criticizing us for being too decisive, being too fast, and being too radical. Because what we've decided to do, which I think is a big, bold thing to do, is to say, look, yes, we've got this massive deficit to deal with, which is controversial, which will court short-term unpopularity, but we're not going to stop there. We're also going to try and reform our politics, which is creaking and clapped out in so many respects. We're going to try and clean up party political funding, for instance, something which I know has been a big issue here too. But we're also going to reform the way we run our schools, the way we run our hospitals. We're going to turn a page on what we both consider was excessive intrusion from central government in people's everyday lives and intrusion into their civil liberties by the previous administration. So we're kind of rediscovering and protecting and cherishing a long British tradition of civil liberties as well. And of course, we are together seeking to play a constructive role in the affairs of the world, not least here at the United Nations, in terms of honoring our commitments, the rich world's commitments to the poor countries around the world. So that's a kind of thumbnail sketch of where we're at. It's very early days. It's 5 months into a 5-year parliament. For those of you who know the British political system, we don't have fixed-term parliaments. So, in the past, whether the election was going to be held on this date or that date was a constant sort of issue of speculation. We've said, no, 5 years, we're going to set the rules very clearly, we're going to do this for 5 years, we're going to try and sort stuff out in that 5-year time, and then people can have their judgment on whether we've done well or not in 5 years. So it's a big new thing. A lot of people in Britain still find it, I think, quite difficult to adapt from a language which is all about if someone's up, someone's down. If someone's won, someone's been crushed underfoot. The kind of sort of testosterone-driven machismo of the kind of Westminster village, that it's always about, people tearing strips off each other, into a much more complex political idiom, discourse, where people are open about their differences, grown up about their differences, but trying to seek also consensus and compromise. So it's a big period of transition for us. I'll have to come back in 5 years' time to tell you whether it's been a success or not. But I hope that thumbnail sketch where we've got to is of some help to you. I've spoken for too long, for which forgive me, but it's difficult to encapsulate that in a few sentences. So over to you. Who wants to ask the first question? Yeah. Do you need to wait for the mic? I guess you do, yeah.
You may be aware that the results in the recent Australian federal election was a curious...
In the what?
Australian federal election was had a curiously similar result to that in the UK, in that it has resulted in the first minority government in pretty much as long as anyone can remember. Do you think that in the context of a wash Westminster style government, that a coalition government is inherently stable enough to reap the benefits of the enhanced democracy? And do you have any pointers for the Australian minority government at the moment?
Well, I wouldn't be foolish enough to start sort of trying to give Julia Gillard, the new Prime Minister, I spoke to her on the phone a couple of weeks ago, any kind of tips. I would observe, by the way, for those people who hanker after the sort of sepia-tinted romanticism of the Westminster model, which is purported to deliver decisive, clear majorities all over the world, that every single Westminster parliamentary system around the world now is either hung or has coalitions. India, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom. So something's going on. It's not just in Britain, something's going on. I would argue possibly some of it's going on here too. I think a lot of the old tribal loyalties and the old political blocs, they're just changing. We're in a period of great flux. The global economy poses huge challenges. Old forms of cultural and social identity are breaking down. And I just think all democracies are kind of dealing with this. And I think as a general rule, it's best when the future is pushing you somewhere to try and move with it and not constantly try and sort of hold it back. And that's what we're trying to do in the British government. Look, in Australia it's slightly different, as you know, because what we've got in Britain is actually a coalition between two parties who now enjoy quite a big majority in the Commons. As the Australian Prime Minister explained to me, she's got a very small, well, it's in effect, I think numerically a minority, is it? I need to check, but anyway, so she's having to spend a lot of time, obviously, making sure that she gets the votes that she needs in Parliament. But I'm not going to, be very foolish of me as a Deputy Prime Minister to start sort of providing a running commentary on what's happening elsewhere. I just observe that I think something seems to be going on in a lot of democracies, and I don't think we know where it's going to evolve yet. But I think there is a political appetite, not everywhere, but there is a political appetite in a less, or in a sort of slightly less ideologically rigid world from the public on politicians to, from time to time, just kind of get stuff sorted and not resort to rigid tribalism. I think there are many people out there who kind of maybe welcome from time to time politicians saying we're going to do stuff in the national interest and set our differences apart. Yep, over there. Yeah, over there.
Thank you. Thanks for your time this morning, Deputy Prime Minister. I have another question about electoral reform. I'm fascinated
Are you
by
also from Australia?
Yes.
Is everybody from Australia here? What's going on?
I don't know if we have a majority here, I suspect. I'm fascinated by the project you're undertaking with partners with very different incentives. What, in your view, will success look like through that project? And if it goes well, what will the UK political ecosystem look like in 20 years?
Ecosystem. You make it sound like a sort of Petri dish. What will success look like? I think success will look roughly as follows. I think, first and foremost, we need to be able to prove to people in 5 years' time that we've dealt with this terrible legacy, which is the kind of dead weight of debt around our neck, and instead of just simply shuffling it off to our children or our grandchildren to pay off our debts or the interest on our debts, to kind of free the British economy of that. Not in a brutal sort of overnight fashion, which is what we're accused of doing, but doing it in a kind of methodical way over 5 years, trying to do it as fairly as possible, trying to make sure that the kind of burden of that adjustment. I mean, the British economy has basically shrunk. It's just kind of gone like that. 6% smaller now than it was a few years ago. We're still spending money as if it was the same size, so we just have to cut our cloth differently. And that's an immediate challenge. I think if we can do that and do that as fairly as possible, and show that the economy's been able to grow in a different way, in a more sustainable way, both sustainable economically, socially, and environmentally, not over-reliant on the financial services system, which is a very important part of our economy and always will and always must remain, but perhaps we became over-reliant on it, but that it should be more geographically spread. That's the most important thing. It's the Clinton stuff. It's the economy stupid. We've got to fix the economy and show we can fix the economy. Then there are a whole lot of other things too. I mean, I think one of the things that sort of the glue that holds the coalition together in a way that I think has frankly surprised David Cameron and myself. I think it surprised us that we both feel so firmly about this, is to pursue, I mean, he might use different language, but what I call a kind of small L liberal approach to empowering communities, empowering parents, pupils, patients in the schools they go to, the hospitals they use, in the decisions they take locally, So for instance, yesterday, or day before yesterday, I think it was, in my party congress, I announced new plans from our government to actually emulate what happens here in the United States anyway, which is to allow our big cities to borrow money prudentially, to be able to do things in their own area, not constantly have to wait cap in hand on handouts from Whitehall. We have the most astonishingly over-centralized system. I mean, I just think it beggars belief compared to the kind of much more devolved arrangements you've got here and which exist in most of Europe, how centralized everything is in the United Kingdom. It's become over-centralized in recent years. So there's going to be a radical kind of power shift away, handing power down, restoring civil liberties, loosening up the politics that I've talked about, giving people a greater sense that they're in charge in their public services. So I think those are probably the two biggest changes of all, which is kind of sort the economy, make people feel it's sorted, and give people a sense that they're more in charge. And do it all in a kind of spirit of being kind of quite open about the fact that we're going to have to take some difficult decisions first for the long-term benefit of the country, and not allow ourselves to be intimidated by kind of short-term squalls and controversies. Let's try and mix it up gender-wise. Yeah.
Hello. I think you wrote an article recently in the Times.
Is there anyone American here? This is really getting,
But I'm British.
Yes,
so.
I know you are. I know.
You wrote
We're
an
cheating,
article
though. We could
in
be
the
speaking 4,000 miles away.
in the Times about the need to make the welfare system
Yep.
an engine of social mobility rather than a giant safety net.
Yep.
A laudable aim. But changing the mindset of a whole group of society with
Yep.
regards to their benefits
Yep.
is no easy task,
No.
especially at a time when the economy's suffering and there's no money in the bank.
Mm.
I was wondering what practical measures the coalition is planning to implement in order to make people active, socially mobile, in charge of their own benefits, and not simply accept handouts from the state.
Yeah. This is an immensely complex issue, which is we have quite a different sort of welfare system in the United Kingdom, which we're very, very proud of. I'm very proud of. It was a liberal Beveridge who, in a sense, was the sort of godfather of the kind of welfare system. But that arguably, in recent years, I think most people accept this, has become very, very big, very, very expensive, where you've got patterns of long-term reliance and dependence on welfare, which have actually now started to repeat themselves over generations. So we have this sort of problem of families and communities who have become sort of benefit reliant over time and over generations. And that's, of course, socially very dangerous, because then you create a form of social segregation, actually, where you get a whole bunch of people who become dependent over the long term on the state. And I think as a progressive liberal, that is not a good thing. Progressive liberals believe that work is good, that people can get on their own 2 feet and so on. So what we have to do, and it's going to take a long time. We're not going to do this overnight. What we're going to try and do is kind of shift the system so that we remain generous and compassionate where we must be, and providing help to the vulnerable and support and so on, but making sure that the system doesn't create perverse incentives where, bluntly, it pays for some people to remain on benefits rather than go into work. And that has basically 2 bits to it. It means that some of the conditions and conditionality attached to the benefits you receive will need to be revisited, and at the same time we need to change the tax system so that if you start work, particularly on low pay, you keep more of your money. And this is something I've been campaigning on for years, and it's why in the kind of budget that we as a coalition government published a couple of months back, we have taken the first step to raising what we call I don't know what you guys call it here, but the allowance, the income tax allowance, so that you pay less tax at the kind of low end. So if you're on low pay, in fact, we've taken 900,000 people on low pay out of paying any income tax at all, and we're going to carry on doing even more of that. I mean, I hope over the next 5 years we will take millions of people on low pay out of paying any income tax at all, so that you get an incentive to get off benefits and into work. Because I think all the evidence is clear. If you can get people into work, it is the best engine of social mobility. It's the best way of dealing with poverty. So that's what we're trying to do. It's very complex, very, very controversial. As you say, the headline, I think, on that, what I thought was a considered and thoughtful article about liberal welfare reform was, that it was a sort of heartless thing to do. I think what is heartless, genuinely believe this, but I think it's heartless, is to be indifferent to the plight of people, families who over generations just kind of resort to a kind of passive reliance on the state. There's nothing compassionate about that at all. So we're going to, it's going to be controversial. We're going to try and change it. It is going to take some time, though. Please tell me you come from North America. If you hands up only if you come from. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, my name's Nathan Brownback. I'm a law student at Columbia. I'm wondering, you've spoken a lot about.
I'm listening. Yeah, sorry.
You've spoken a lot about the areas in which your party and the Conservatives have been able to cooperate. I think it seems there are a lot of important differences that remain too.
Sure.
One of which Britain's role as a nuclear state and the Trident system.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, given Defense Minister Fox's statement last week that he's only willing to tolerate minor delays on the Trident review, what do you think is going to happen in that area coming up, and how are you going to make sure the Liberal Democratic voice is heard?
Well, nothing's been decided yet. We've been very open in our coalition agreement that the Liberal Democrats will retain our view and continue to argue for alternative systems to the sort of automatic like-for-like replacement of the Trident system. For those of you who not aware of this, Britain's a nuclear power. We've got a Trident system which was created and designed and established at the height of the Cold War. And my party and myself have for some time now been questioning whether it is absolutely vital to meet future security challenges that we roll it over completely unchanged. Now, at the same time, we've accepted that as a government, we're committed to replacing the system, but subject to a kind of examination of costs. That examination of costs, what we call a value for money study, neither David Cameron nor myself have seen it yet. I think it's near completion. As soon as I come back from this summit, we'll be looking at these things next week and the following weeks, up to an announcement around October the 20th, when we announce the kind of funding settlement for all government departments, including the Ministry of Defence. So all of these things are in the mix: timing, value for money, precise dimensions of the system, and all the rest of it. I mean, there are therefore these differences within the coalition, which we've been very open about. Very open about. There's no point of denying them. There's also, just bluntly, huge financial pressure. Whichever government was in power, of whatever political complexion, would have to deal with the fact that the renewal of the Trident system over time, not immediately, but over time, is a very expensive thing to do, and would have to come out of the budget of the Ministry of Defence, which of course has a huge number of other pressures. We're at war in Afghanistan. We're committed to a number of other big weapon systems that cost a lot of money over the coming years. So this would have to be looked at in the round anyway. And there's a big issue here and a big debate which underlies all of this, which is what kind of threats do you think we're gonna face in the future, and are we equipping ourselves with the right kind of technology, the right kind of know-how, the right kind of resources to do that? So that's a kind of a very candid kind of account of the different elements of the debate, and we will seek on this, like so many other things, to kind of overcome our differences and come up with an approach that we're all happy with, which I hope will kind of square the circle of some of those concerns. Yep. Do you want to wait for the mic?
My name is Ben Miller. I'm a freshman in the College of Arts and Science here at NYU. So in Britain, with the coalition, it seems as though in order for the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives to work together and to sort of bridge the differences, there was sort of a process of finding a rational basis, sort of a set of issues that everyone could agree were issues where there of course was disagreement, but there was a sort of general agreement on what has to be done. I mean, no one's in favor of increasing deficits explicitly.
Some people are. Yeah.
Well, and for its own sake. I guess I was wondering if you had any prescriptions for bringing that kind of rational discussion to a political system like the one in the United States, where there's this sort of increasing loony extremism, and it often seems as though there's no way to even agree on what the issues are, much less how to go about solving them.
Well, I think it would be a huge mistake, and it would be a false portrayal of what we're trying to do if I was suddenly sort of being terribly holier than thou and saying, we've found the holy grail of civilized, rational politics. There's plenty of uncivilized, irrational debate which goes on in our parliament every day. I just think that kind of the rule of thumb, which I've always taken, is you kind of got to do what the real bosses tell you to do, which is the voters. You know, this was all driven by the fact that voters said, we don't think none of you won. No one won. I mean, it's kind of I'm quite pragmatic about this. If no one wins, as I say, you've got two choices. You either keep asking people the same question over and over again, or you say, okay, let's get on with it. Let's try and provide good, stable government. And I think the fact was this sort of backcloth of a kind of sense of semi-crisis in our public finances also put a lot of onus on us not to do the easy kind of political tribal thing. So those are the combination of events. But I think it would be a huge mistake for me to start pretending that we can transplant those set of circumstances to other political systems, or indeed that, you know, we don't have things to learn from what happens elsewhere. That's not the way I view it at all. Sorry, I'm being far too rational, probably. Yes, lady here. Just behind you, yeah.
My name is Caroline Maris. I'm a junior here at the College of Arts and Sciences at NYU. My question is this. You were introduced as an international figure, as someone who is a cosmopolitan, has worked all over the world, speaks these languages, and I understand you're speaking to the UN later today about the UK's commitment to aid in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, given all the domestic issues you have
Mm-hmm.
at home, given the pressures of the global economy, what do you see as any nation's role, let alone a nation that is as influential as the UK or the United States? What do you feel that their role can be in this situation on the international stage, given that there's so many problems to deal with at home?
Well, if it's complex, as we've talked about, to sometimes make people work together in domestic politics, it's an inescapable duty on us, I think, to work together internationally. I mean, it's a trite thing to say, but I think sort of isolationism or kind of excessive unilateralism in a world where we are as interdependent as we are is not only irrational, it's self-defeating. We are condemned to work together. The degree to which we become dependent on each other has only increased over time, whether it's the common environmental threat we face, whether it's the way in which ripple effects in the economy, you know, a crisis in the American housing market has had devastating consequences for other parts of the global economy. Over-leveraged British banks have a devastating effect on banking systems on the other side of the planet. Whether it's the growth of new forms of extremism and terrorism, new ideologies which escape the old kind of 19th century state. I mean, I'll be talking about this at the UN General Assembly on Friday. We're dealing with an environment where ideologies can no longer be mapped onto countries or blocks of countries. They now transcend countries. They have as much to do with religious identity, ethnic identity, sub-national identity. It's a kind of, you know, and we've still got the old kind of tools of nation states and multilateral bodies bringing together these government representatives, of which I'm one this week, but actually dealing with a world where actually many of the challenges kind of escape those distinctions. So we need to reinvent some of the multilateral organizations which were created after the Second World War, not to abandon multilateralism, but to refresh it and reform it and reinvent it and strengthen it. And that's why I'm a sort of liberal multilateralist to my fingertips. I just don't see how I, as someone who's accountable to my constituents, I have a constituency in Sheffield, a northern town in England. I'm accountable to them. I'm accountable to the country, as is the Prime Minister, as Deputy Prime Minister of this coalition government. I don't see how we can provide security, jobs, safety, sustainability, justice to our citizens who we represent, unless we do our bit around the world working with others to promote all those things. I've never understood logically the kind of the worldview that some people still seem to retain, which is somehow you can put up the drawbridge, turn your back on the rest of the world. I don't think you can do what you're duty bound as a democratic politician to do for your citizens if you approach the world in that way. Yep, chap at the back there.
Hi, I'm Matteo from NYU Stern School of Business. You talked a lot about international cooperation, the fact you cannot, and just show your back to the other people. And I know that within your coalition there are different attitudes with respect to the European Union.
Uh-huh.
And so I was wondering also what would your government attitude would be in that respect, also in light of what we just talked about international cooperation.
Sure. Well, the European Union, for those of you not sort of familiar with exactly how it works, basically a big club, I'm sure you all know this, but it's worth just restating, of European nations. It had its genesis as a sort of as part of a kind of act of Franco-German reconciliation after the last war, and it's flourished into something a whole lot more ambitious. It's got how many members has it got now? 27, and it's the biggest single European market in the world. It's a highly integrated form of economic cooperation, but goes well beyond economic cooperation. We cooperate dealing with international crime, economic regulation, some aspects of social policy, agricultural policies, how we fish in our seas. It's without a doubt the most sophisticated and ambitious form of supranational governance anywhere in the world, and I would argue perhaps at any time as well. It's not without its controversies, it's not without its problems, it's not without its bureaucracy, it's not without its kind of daft decisions, but as an experiment in first peaceful reconciliation over war, and then secondly in terms of identifying how we have a shared self-interest in doing things together, because we're basically stronger together and weaker apart. It's an astonishing. The ambition of it, I think, is often not properly appreciated. Now, yeah, as you say, there is a clear difference, which is that the Liberal Democrats are the most pro-European party in British politics, not because we're starry-eyed, not at all. Far from it. I spent some time working in Europe. I can guarantee you, any times, but you tear your hair out sometimes the way things are decided. But just because of what I said earlier, just because we don't think that you can deal with international crime, you can't deal with immigration, you can't deal with environmental degradation, you can't deal with kind of big corporate powers in the global economy unless you deal with these things together. So there has been, but I think we found it relatively easy in coalition governments to say, look, we, the Liberal Democrats, are not going to sort of carry on advocating a constant sort of Maoist revolution of new treaties, new commitments, new ambitions for the European Union. For those of you who aren't aware, it's a club which has gone through a huge period of change as one set of treaties and legal documents has replaced another. So we've kind of said, look, we'll draw a line under that. We won't constantly sort of agitate for change. We'll let the thing kind of just work as it is. And the Conservatives having said, if you like, in return, and it's not quite as crude as that, but they said, okay, well, we're going to play a leading constructive role in the European Union, which is exactly what we are doing. I had a meeting last night here in New York with our Foreign Secretary, William Hague, a Conservative. William and I went to Berlin together. Two individuals with very, very different reputations on the issue of Europe. Actually, we found it relatively easy to talk together to an important partner such as the German government in the national interest. So it's an interesting example where coalition politics appears to be working very, very well, even on an issue which has traditionally divided us very, very starkly. Yep, go over that. Yeah. Do you want to just wait for it?
My name's Alex Sesnak. I'm a graduate student in education here at NYU. I want to build on what the question he just asked. In terms of cooperation on immigration within the EU, I know right now there's been some issues in France with the Roma. You also spoke earlier about the commitment of rich countries. How do you see that shaping up in the UK? Or
what shaping up?
I'm sorry. What do you see as the responsibility of EU countries to other EU countries in terms of immigration?
To other EU countries?
Yeah.
Well, clearly, because this gets into seriously arcane European stuff, but there's basically a club within a club. So a large number of the countries within the European Union have entered into something called Schengen. And the Schengen, I forgot what it's called, treaty, whatever, agreement, basically removes, sorry? Schengen Accords. We have an expert. We have a resident expert on Schengen. The Schengen Accords basically lift any border controls and the movement of people between one country and the next. So if you drive from Paris to Amsterdam, you won't even, you won't even know that you've gone from one country to the next. So that means that the movement of people is seamless, across countries. So by definition, therefore, you have to work together to deal with people who are coming into the European Union and traveling across it. So there's a very, very sophisticated level of cooperation on immigration, as there is on other areas, and as there should be. Just on, because you hinted at it, this kind of our commitment to not each other in the European Union, but to the poorer countries in the world. I think I'm right in saying that 80% of all asylum seekers, not economic migrants, asylum seekers seeking asylum in the United Kingdom, are fleeing conflict. So when people say to me, why have you gone to New York to sort of talk about giving more help to countries on the other side of the planet when we've got so many difficulties at home? I say, well, first, it's the right thing to do, but secondly, it's in our enlightened self-interest. If people want to deal with the kind of factors that push people to leave their homes, leave their families, leave their villages, leave their communities, and move across borders and countries and continents, you've got to help them deal with the poverty and the crisis and the hunger and the conflict they face. 22 out of the 34 countries that are furthest from meeting the Millennium Development Goal targets are countries in conflict. We have no self-interest in allowing the conditions which breed conflict to continue. And that, I think, has a direct and indirect impact on immigration policy as much as anything else. I'm going to try and be a bit more rapid in my answers, because I think lots of you are wanting to ask. Yeah.
I'm Alex Ruthizer. I'm from the Stern MBA program here. Many thanks for being here today. My question is, can you articulate the electoral reform platform and maybe go into how you plan to do it and how long it's going to take? Will it be ready for the next election?
Yep. I'll try to. Basically, I kind of like democracy, so I think we should start practicing it in the United Kingdom, because at the moment we've got an electoral system which gives thumping majorities, not this time, but usually, to parties, even though only a minority of people have voted for them. You've got an electoral system which basically gives hundreds of MPs, members of parliament, jobs for life, no questions asked, even though only, 30% of people in their districts, in their constituencies have voted for them. And I think it creates a political elite which are out of touch. I think it creates arrogance. I think it's personally one of the things that contributed towards, as you will have seen, the expenses scandals we had, because it creates a kind of caste-like quality to our politics, where people go down to Westminster, they don't really need to bother with the people who they should be accountable to, because they know that all they need to do is kind of muster 30% of the vote next time. I want a system which A, reflects a little bit more fairly how people vote, but most importantly of all, makes politicians work much harder for your vote, and so that you can't be taken for granted. And I don't think our system does that. So we want to change it, and I'm not going to ruin meeting today by going into the undergrowth of acronyms about different electoral systems. But basically, we are having a referendum, which we hope to hold next May, on an alternative, on a different system called the alternative vote system, which basically would allow people to rank their candidates in order of preference, which some people say doesn't go far enough, some people say goes too far, but it would certainly be a serious improvement on what we've got at the moment. Yep, lady here.
Hi, my name's Sarah. I'm doing the Global Affairs programme, which is a master's programme at NYU. Mr. Clegg, in July this year at Prime Minister's Question time, when acting in capacity as the leader of the United Kingdom in David Cameron's absence,
I know what you stated.
Yeah. You stated that the Iraq War was illegal. You later stated that this is your personal view and that the government does not have a view as to the legality of it. Can you articulate why the government has chosen not to take a stance on this? And if you were the Prime Minister and the government was a wholly Lib Dem one under your leadership, would you encourage your government to take an official stance on this?
Oh, you're inviting me to have a sort of reverie about a world in which the Liberal Democrats would reign supreme. Look, as you guessed, what? What's your view? No, I was going to give you my view. Give me a moment. I've got to be quick, though. I'm being gesticulated at. Look, yeah, I'm not going to sort of hide the fact that I've said before, and I believe that the military invasion in Iraq was not legally justified. But that is something that I think will be thrashed out by lawyers. It's not something which, as a government, on such a sort of sensitive legal issue, we are taking a position. And so it's right that I clarify that it's kind of my personal view. It's perhaps another display of this kind of new political environment where people are having to understand that you've got a government with people who are seeking agreement for the benefit of the country, but it doesn't mean that we're always going to agree on things that that happened in the past. And that's certainly the case on the invasion of Iraq, where, as you know, my party, the Liberal Democrats, were staunch opponents of that, and the Conservatives were advocates of it. But hey, that's, if not exactly history, it's something which is not going to sort of bedevil this government, because we're trying to sort of point ourselves to a common future. I've got to, with that rather pious answer, I've got to end, I think, is that right? Where am I? So they've gone. Yes, I've got to go because they've gone anyway. But can I just thank you very, very much indeed? Can I thank everybody involved with this event? I enjoyed it enormously. I hope it was of some help and interest to you. Thank you very much.
You can tell that we could have gone on forever. You can also, we can tell why you won the debate, and we're going to hold you to your promise that you're going to come back after a few years and reflect on all you've been able to accomplish. So thank you very, very much. Please let the Deputy Prime Minister exit, and then you will exit. You're going that way?
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.